It's always pleasant to walk around Abney Park and stare at the monuments and read the inscriptions, but one of the most striking is that to P.C. William Tyler. There, exquisitely, rendered in marble, are a policeman's helmet, cape, truncheon and belt, and the inscription tells us that P.C. Tyler was killed on the 23rd of January 1909, 112 years ago, in the Tottenham Outrage. Hello, I'm Alan Gartrell. I do tours and talks around Abney Park Cemetery, and talking on the Tottenham Outrage is one of my favourites. And here to mark that anniversary, we had hoped to make a film, but what with the pandemic, lockdown, and being unable to afford the helicopters and makeup, I'm afraid it's just me talking here in my sitting room, but hopefully Zach in the office may be able to put some illustrations in as I talk. As I say, it's one of my favourite. It's a tremendously dramatic story. Its cinematic possibilities were almost instantly seen. It is at times a comedy with shades of the Keystone Cops and knockabout farce. But of course, it was an armed robbery, almost unique, that 1,000 shots of live ammunition were fired and people died in it. As we saw P.C. Tyler, and just behind his impressive monument is a little marble cross paid for by Earlsmead School in respect of one of its pupils, Ralph Joscelyne, who was also killed in the outrage. And what about the perpetrators? So we know them as Jacob Lepidus and Paul Hayfeld. I say I know them because, as we will come across later, another Latvian had some 18 aliases. They're always described as Latvian Jewish anarchists. So let's try and investigate the mystery, tell the story, and unpack some of those terms. Latvians. Well, Latvia was part of the Imperial Russian Empire at that time. So in 1905, 4 years before the outrage, there had been a failed precursor to the Russian Revolution. And as a result of this, there had been a crackdown, and many Latvian radicals were forced to leave or fled. Jewish. Well, there had been anti-Semitic pogroms, Cossack outrages, and other things, say in the latter part of the 19th century, and this was exacerbated after the revolution. And then lastly, anarchism, possibly the most complicated of the terms. Certainly the press and people generally tended to use it as a blanket term for all sorts of socialist, anarchist, nihilistic political movements. And certainly Lepidus and Hayfeld were members of the Latvian Socialist Party. Now, one way that might give us some help at looking at this is what bookshops would call local author, Józef Korzeniowski, possibly better known to all of us, certainly better known to me as Joseph Conrad. And he lived or lodged for a while in the 1880s, 1880, 1886, at 6 Hadinova Road, Stoke Newington. Or at least for those times when he wasn't concentrating on becoming a master mariner in the South China Seas. He wrote a book called The Secret Agent, which is set in 1886, just when he left Stoke Newington. And it's reckoned that its protagonists, Mr. and Mrs. Verloc, are to a degree sort of modelled on his landlords at Hadinova Road, Adolf and Mrs. Krieger. Certainly Mrs. Krieger had a handicapped brother, which is a strand which is incorporated into the book. And it discusses a whole range of radical philosophies, from nihilism through to a form of utopianism. And in our terms, it's a le Carré-like story of deception and double agents and it's political radicalism. And what is probably a Russian government, it's kept anonymous in the book, but probably a Russian government attempting to interfere in the political affairs of Great Britain. Conrad, as a Pole, had no doubt had his own views on the Russian Empire. And just in passing, and to bring it up to date, I would mention that it was a favourite book of Ted Kaczynski. You find the Unabomber. Do you remember him from the 1880s and 90s? But why did Conrad, who set this book in 1886, publish it in 1907, just 2 years prior to the Tottenham Outrage? Well, firstly, he had been mulling over something that happened in 1894, which was an anarchist attempt. It had to blow up the Greenwich Observatory. It had the ultimate nihilist act to attempt to destroy time or possibly geography itself. And in actuality, and in the book, this is thwarted by the bombers blowing themselves up, and what in Northern Ireland the security services used to call, to say, an own goal. And if our image of an anarchist is a bomb-throwing assassin, perhaps the events of the 1890s would give some credence to this. In 1894, there's the assassination of the French president. Say in 1897, it had the assassination of the Spanish prime minister. 1898, the beloved Sissi, Empress of Austria, is stabbed by Lake Geneva. Say 1900, the King of Italy is assassinated. In 1901, McKinley, the President of the United States, is murdered by an anarchist. And radical Russian immigration into Great Britain had probably started with the assassination of the liberal Tsar Alexander in 1881. And as said, the book outlines, the book The Secret Agent, outlines attempt to make the British government more repressive to European radicals. So that gives some of the background. Now, Lepidus and Hayfield had fled Latvia. They'd lived in Paris for a while with Lepidus's brother, but he, in 1907, had had his own goal and blown himself up in an attempt to kill another French president. Lepidus and Hayfield flee to Scotland and then to Tottenham. And Tottenham had a name, say, of Little Russia. It's say North Tottenham. They both belonged to the Socialist Revolutionary Party, and the Latvian Socialist Revolutionary Party had a reputation for the expropriation of private property or funding itself through robbery. There had been an enormous raid on the Bank of Helsinki in 1906. Now, others said that Hayfield and Lepidus had criminal reputations and might have been in it for personal gain. But afterwards, when Lepidus's room was searched, there was so much anarchist literature, they had to take it away in a car. So again, perhaps as in Northern Ireland, motives were mixed. So, returning to this wages job, say in 1909, Sherman's rubber factory. Tottenham had a speciality in the rubber industry. But Sherman's was a bit of a sweatshop. It paid very low wages and virtually only employed immigrant labour, including for a while Hayfield. So he would have known that Saturday was payday. So at 9:30, he and Lepidus were standing outside the doors of the factory. Say at 9:30, a car with Schneermann's chauffeur and the office boy returned from a Hackney bank with the wages for 150 staff, some £80 sterling. As they attempted to enter, Lepidus grabbed grabbed the bag, and there was a struggle. Hellfield came out with the gun and fired several times. Wilson, the chauffeur, had a heavy leather coat, but it was later found to be peppered with bullets, and his clothes were cut right through to his vest, but fortunately he incurred no injury. So the bag was wrestled from Kayworthy, the office boy, and they set off. They didn't get far before Lepidus was again brought down by a rugby tackle from a passing stoker. Hellfield again fired several times, and the man again, luckily, George Smith escaped with no harm. But of course, this was possibly the first mistake, because Schneermann's was right opposite Tottenham Police Station. And not just a police station, but a police section house. It was a building literally full of sleeping policemen, or policemen coming off duty, on duty, fine getting up, and there's nothing like a fusillade of shots from outside your front door to bring you out. So a policeman comes streaming out the door. Now, the police station has no telephone. It does have a gun cupboard, but unfortunately no one can find the key. And the robbers set off down Chestnut Road into Scales Road. You can follow the route of the chase yourself if you're interested now. 30 police in all sorts of dress and undress are in close pursuit. The inspector has got on his horse in pursuit, but also heading for the municipal dust destructor, the council rubbish depot, which he knows has a telephone. The car is started up again by the chauffeur, and with the concerned Mr. Schneermann inside and police on the running board, it sets off down Scales Road, turns into Mitchley Road. Shouts and noise, it attracts attention. A mob of housewives throw potatoes at the robbers. The noise in the car attracts attention. Mitchley Road fills up. Now, the robbers have been firing all the time. So they've reloaded, they fire at the car and incapacitate it by hitting the radiator. But in the crossfire, the 10-year-old Ralph Joscelyne, who is minding a baker's horse and cart, is shot and dies instantly. If you go down Mitchley Road today, there is a small blue plaque on the Good Shepherd Church there commemorating him. But I say the car has been incapacitated, but there are more and more people following, and perhaps the second error comes into play. Nobody at Schneermann's gets paid in notes, and the £80 sterling, or say of coin in the bag, weighs some 20 pounds, 9 kilos, 10 bags of sugar. And we don't know what the getaway plan was, but they're now heading for the marshes. Now, some police, including PC Tyler, take a shortcut, anxious to cut them off before they get to the Stonebridge Lock bridge. But there at the dust destructor, Tyler shouts out, the game's up, give yourself up. A shot is fired, Tyler falls and is shot and is taken into a nearby house. He dies later. There is a plaque commemorating him on the side of the Tottenham Police Station in Chestnut Road. Lepidus and Hayfield cross the railway line, pausing to steal the green cap off the head of the level crossing keeper's wife. They cross the Lock Bridge, where they make a brief stand behind the bridge walls and wound some of the pursuers. But there are now up to 1,000 people in pursuit. It's market day. Stoke Newington police have been alerted, and some are riding up. Men are running into their houses. There are no gun laws. Men are running into their houses and are producing their Boer War souvenir pistols and giving it to the police to chase and fire. It's Saturday, so there's football going on in the marshes. So the footballers join in pursuit. There are wildfowlers shooting duck on the marshes, and they're encouraged to take pot shots. Fire is returned, and one of the wildfowlers gets a bullet through his hat. Meanwhile, the police gunsmith down in Holborn has sent up 3 taxis full of weapons, including a machine gun, which thankfully is not deployed. It's hard work on the marshes, and Hayfelt and Lepidus stop at several points, using buildings and haystacks as cover. So they reach close to the crooked billet roundabout as they get across the marshes, and they see a number 9 tram heading for the Baker's Arms. Lepidus stops it, and the driver takes the opportunity to run upstairs and hide. Hayfield catches up and gets on board, and Lepidus finds the conductor and tells him to drive it. He has never driven a tram before, but with a revolver pressed to his head, he's encouraged to try. He sets off, all the time having the fear in his mind that his colleague upstairs will lean on the brake bar and bring the whole thing to a halt. So they pass a tram going the other way, have police behind, commandeer it, reverse it, and set off in pursuit, exchanging shots. So there is a wildly unhistoric 1910 feature film of the Tottenham Outrage, showing the trams in pursuit and exchanging shots like a Western. But in fact, I think the tram kept back, knowing that the lines would ultimately end. However, in other forms of transport, the police were in pursuit. They'd commandeered a car, and they'd also commandeered an advertising cart, horse-drawn, which came quite close up to the tram before Hayfeld shot the horse and the cart overturned in a mess of posters and paste. So this time, an elderly man who'd been sitting on the tram all this time attempts to rescue the conductor and is shot in the neck. You find the conductor manages to convince Lepidus that round the corner is a police station. It's not true, but he obviously told a good story. Like seeing a milkman's cart, the 2 anarchists jump off, shoot the milkman, steal the cart, and set off. They take a corner too fast and overturn it, but they then see a greengrocer's cart, steal that. They set off with that, but fail to take the brake off. So the police are closing in. They make a run for it, but turn up a dead end. There's a fence there. Lepidus manages to climb over it, but Hayfeld, who was known at Schneermann's by his nickname Elephant, is unable, and he uses one of his last 2 bullets to shoot himself in the head. Lepidus continues up the hill into Hale End. He gets to the Royal Oak public house, runs through the back. The hue and cry is still going on. There's a small cottage, virtually one up, one down. The lady of the house comes to the front door. Lepidus gets in through the back door, bolts the front door. He's in there with her children. He desperately tries to climb up the chimney, perhaps hoping to escape over the roofs, finds he can't do it, runs upstairs. The police manage to get the children out. A policeman says given another of these guns by a passing strangers, climbs up a ladder, sees Lepidus there, tries to shoot him, realises he doesn't know how to take the safety catch off the gun, quickly descends the ladder. Then 2 or 3 police get into the house. So they run up the stairs with their guns. They fire a fusillade of shots, but as the inquest subsequently showed, Lepidus had managed to shoot himself. And that is the end of the chase. And apart from £5 found on Lepidus, Nobody knows what's happened to the money. Over the years, Abney Park Cemetery has seen some grand funerals. Those of Catherine Booth, and then had General Booth of the Salvation Army, James Braidwood of the London Fire Service, Captain Denny of the Old Contemptibles. But certainly that on January the 29th, 1909, the joint funerals of P.C. Tyler and Ralph Joscelyne, how was there. How perhaps unusually it came down the hill from Tottenham, but it's considered over 500,000 people turned out to watch the funeral parade. 3,000 police lined the route. The Scots Guards marched. The garrison artillery marched. The police band was playing the Dead March from Saul, and a hearse with black plumes came along bearing the coffin of P.C. Tyler, and one with white plumes bearing that of Ralph Joscelyne. The crush was so much that in fact the cortege didn't reach Abney Park until an hour later than scheduled, at 4 o'clock, at which time one would have thought it would be fairly dark. A fusillade was fired over the open graves. How the Russian Consul General sent a wreath with an explanatory note saying that Latvians weren't really Russians. And that was the funeral. But of course the consequences went on much longer. There was an inquest, there was compensation. Our compensation culture still existed, and money was paid for the various dead and spavined horses, the overturned carts, had damaged trousers, had a carpet in the house where P.C. Tyler died, don't think about it too much, and awards were made. Those of you that have seen my talks on war heroes will know about my theory: the bigger the disaster, the more Victoria crosses. And certainly here 5 or 6 PCs were made up instantly to sergeant rank. How medals were distributed, how financial how rewards given out, how the superintendent of Stoke Newington Police Station received a silver-plated tea service. George Smith, the brave stoker who rugby tackled Lepidus, got £25. However, how Mrs. Tyler, I've spoken about the sweatshop wages of 50p a week at Sherman's, how she was given a pension of 30p a week, terminable if she married, which she did subsequently. However, how she is buried with her husband, her first husband, at Abney, and she died in 1937. Similarly, Ralph Joscelyne's, her mother, is says buried with him, and apparently with his shoes in her coffin. So those are some of the compensation claims and the aftermath. The level crossing keeper's wife received compensation for her stolen green hat. So that's the sad end to this this strange story. I do generally on the tour give a little coda about the siege of Sydney Street, and I'll explain why, but first I will say, if you want to know more about the outrage, there are books available, those by Janet Harris, Patricia Collier, Claire Eastwood, Gordon Barton, which can be found. So, why do we talk about Sydney Street? It is, of course, iconic with that picture of Winston Churchill in his top hat, peering around the corner, flanked by the Scots Guards, who've been called out again for service. And it is, of course, it only happened in the following year, in 1910, or at least the robbery at the Houndsditch Jewellers, which started the matter. So this was an attempted robbery at a jewellers by a gang of Latvians, again members of the Latvian Socialist Party. They were led by a man called George Gartrell. He is the Latvian I mentioned that had some 18 aliases. and he incurred fatal wounds in the course of the robbery. But 3 House City of London policemen were shot dead in the course of this, and afterwards there was a national hunt for the perpetrators. And sometimes later, on the 3rd of January, 2 were identified as being holed up in Sydney Street, say in Whitechapel. I have said how they were Latvians and anarchists, Bolsheviks, whatever. And I hadn't thought there were many links, but you'll see there are ideas that there might have been a mystery mastermind behind it. Not that the Tottenham Outrage shows great signs of planning. And also, both parties might have got their impressive weaponry, which was state-of-the-art and much better than the police's, from the same arms dealer who was mysteriously found dead on the New Year's Day between the Houndsditch robbery and the siege of Sydney Street, with the symbol for informer cut into his cheeks. So, at Sydney Street, perhaps because of that impressive weaponry, Churchill called in the Scots Guards. The house caught on fire, and the 2 people therein had died in the fire. But thereafter, a number of other people were arrested, and 4 of them went to trial at the Old Bailey. There are mysterious figures, as there's a lot of mystery in these stories. Peter the Painter is probably the best known, but nobody really seems to know whether he exists. But Tower Hamlets, another mystery, had decided to name their social housing blocks in Sydney Street Peter House and Painter House. It beggars belief in some way. As does the fact that the 4 people tried at the Old Bailey, 3 were acquitted, 1 was convicted, but then that conviction was overturned on appeal, so they all walked free. Now, one of those people, and probably the one who did shoot the 3 policemen, was a man called Jacob Peters. He returned to Russia, in the course of the revolution. Arthur Ransom, the author of Swallows and Amazons, knew him in Moscow and thought he was a rather pleasant Anglophile. He was, in fact, the deputy head of the Cheka. Now, Russia has always had a very impressive and aggressive state security apparatus, whether that's the Okhrana in Tsarist Russia or its various manifestations in Soviet Russia, the OGPU, the Cheka, the NKVD, the KGB. Vladimir Putin was the KGB station officer in Leipzig when the Berlin Wall came down. And of course now the FSB with its keen interest in English cathedral cities. Anyway, Jacob Peters was the deputy head of the Cheka. Perhaps to settle that debate about anarchists and Bolsheviks, he was definitely a Bolshevik and did say he had signed the death sentences on at least 600 anarchists. He also apologised in the early days that the Cheka had only executed some 6,000 people because they were sort of only getting their eye in. So he was a loyal henchman to Lenin and then to Stalin, and very much involved in Stalin's purges. Perhaps the problems with Stalin's purges was that he liked to have a theme. Whether it was the kulaks, the generals, find the doctors, the old Bolsheviks. And come the end of the 1930s, 1937, 1938, it was the Latvians' turn. And almost just to have a Latvian name seemed to be enough to subject you to trial, imprisonment and death. Certainly over 16,000 recorded death sentences and estimates of 73,000 Latvian casualties in one way or another, including Jacob Peters. Say allegedly. As I say, there is much in this story cloaked in mystery. But there you are. It's a long, strange trip from a wages bag snatch in Tottenham all the way to the heart of the Great Terror in Moscow. I hope you have enjoyed it, and I understand there will now be a Q&A session. I look forward to hearing from you. Right. Well, hello. How was that for you? I thought it was pretty strange doing these talks via Skype and YouTube sort of live, but just seeing one person. But recording it cold like that on my own was even stranger. Needless to say, I have a few notes and corrections. Firstly, the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, slip of the tongue, of course. He sent his 16 bombs out from the late 1970s to the early 1990s. When I talked about a car being needed to take away anarchist literature, that was in fact from Hayfelt's room, not Lepidus. Hayfelt, who had both been a sailor and a printer, and I think they were probably smuggling in literature. I mentioned Arthur Ransom, of course, as a journalist and children's author and part-time double agent, possibly used and mistrusted by both sides. I mean, he was married to Trotsky's secretary. And then, I said that George Smith, the stoker who rugby tackled Lepidus, was unharmed. He did have a couple of grazes from bullet shots, but it couldn't have been that bad, because apparently he went in and did his shift that day at Hornsey Gasworks. So there are some questions, I think. So one was, what was the mark of the informer, somebody has asked. I think it was something like an S, and it was probably Latvian. I find the initial of the word for informer, but no, the Leon Behrens murder is quite an interesting possible link between the two cases, and of course how very impressive armaments that the anarchists had in both events, far outclassing those of the police. Yeah, yes. Well, they did have guns. As I said, they had guns at Tottenham, though they'd lost the key and they had to smash the case. But yes, you're quite right. There was an immediate, outcry for the police to be better armed, but I think that got rather lost in working parties and heaven knows what else, and they weren't greatly better armed at the time of the Sydney Street. And of course, the 3 policemen who were shot were simply carrying their truncheons with no firearms at all. Someone asked about the burial places of Lepidus and Hayfeld and if they're at Abney as well. No, I think they were buried in unmarked graves in Tottenham and Walthamstow, and I know Lepidus was sort of buried with just the name Jacob because the police weren't entirely sure. I mentioned about aliases; they weren't entirely sure what his actual name was. And Hayfeld, who lived through to the middle of February, he was buried in, and I think the only thing they'd had recorded that he said was the rather sort of enigmatic and touching phrase, "How my mother lives in Riga." Yes, well, I've been asked about the about the film, and yeah, it has the catchy title of Dr. Brian Pelly and the Secret Dispatch, and but clearly some of those bits we saw of the tram race and the siege of the house. So clearly the house was not. Yeah, I didn't have so many people inside as the film shows. I'm not aware of any other sort of cultural legacy. Sydney Street, Siege of Sydney Street. Say Alfred Hitchcock used that as the sort of closing scenes of The Man Who Knew Too Much in 1934. Other legacies, well, yes, the firearms things for the police. Also, the Tottenham Outrage led to the introduction of what was then the King's Police Medal and now the Queen's Police Medal. But as I say, before that, it didn't exist. And as I said, I have my reviews. You know, the more medals and things that are handed out, you realise there's a feeling things have gone slightly wrong. I'm trying to think. We had some other questions earlier, which I don't seem to have in front of me now. Yes. Yeah, a question about anti-Semitism and the whole thing of the Aliens Act, and perhaps going back to Joseph Conrad. And I asked, why did Conrad write this book that he set in 1886, but why did he write it in 1907? Well, I think he had seen the incoming sort of Eastern European and Jewish immigration. There had been the Aliens Act in 1905, which was the first time how restrictions on immigration were, say, introduced. And he, in his book, postulates this unnamed foreign power concerned that Britain is too lax in its treatment of immigrants and particularly political radicals, and tries and sets out agents provocateurs. So there's a sense in which Conrad perhaps saw what was happening, because there's Siege of Sydney Street. I mean, there are various theories. There's a theory that Peter the Painter was an agent of the Tsarist government, who is setting up these crimes to make the British government be more oppressive. There's a theory that Jacob Peters, the Anglophile Peters, was he an agent for MI5 doing something similar? And certainly after the Siege of Sydney Street, how Winston Churchill did try to bring in, under the 10-minute rule in Parliament, the Aliens, I think it's Prevention of Crime Act, but Parliament wouldn't go along with it, and one of the MPs, one of the Wedgwoods, said, though loss of human life is tragic, it is not as bad as the death of English liberties. But of course, come 1916 or 1914, the First World War leads to various Enemy Aliens Acts. Somebody asked about Conrad, Conrad in Stoke Newington. I've got no idea really how many days he was there, if you like, in that period in the first half of the 1880s, because obviously a lot of the time he would have been sailing, but he did live there. He obviously knew the Kriegers quite well. They lent him money at some points. I think there are various disagreements, and it's obviously not a very flattering portrait in the secret agent. But as I say, I have no little snippets of him walking around Abney or anything else. We just have that link there. He lived for a while in Tollington Park, up in Finsbury Park before he went to Dinnerver Road. There's a question about other bits of the aftermath of the outrage in Tottenham. Of course, there was an inquest, a coroner's inquest, and so when I do the talk walking around, I always like to bring in perhaps my favourite inhabitant of the cemetery, which is William Henry Pennington. And he, as a man in his 80s, was chosen to be the foreman of the jury because he was an elocution teacher and obviously had bearing and a good voice. I say he had bearing because he had been a soldier, and 55 years earlier he had charged with Cardigan's dragoons in the charge of the Light Brigade, having only joined the army some 6 months earlier. I think that probably he probably thought that was enough, because he then left the army, went into acting. He may have been the licensee of Sadler's Wells. He was certainly William Ewart Gladstone's favourite Hamlet, and I say he crops up in this story as well. But say otherwise in Tottenham, well, I think there was still a lot of Russian and Jewish, say, immigration up there, and so that's really some of the aftermath. So, well, I hope people found that interesting. It'll be nice when we can do it again for real, live around the cemetery, and how some of the other talks that myself and other people I'll give. And well, as I say, let's hope we can do some live ones, but who knows, we might be doing some of these recorded ones as well in the future. So thank you very much, and good night.